essential and vulnerable essential workers in sexual violence. And I would like to introduce, or Shelby, would you like to introduce yourself? My fabulous colleague from Calcasa.
Yes, thank you, Meghna. Hello, everyone. My name is Shelby Phillips, the Project and Communications Coordinator with Calcasa, pronouns she, hers. Happy to be here with you all today to provide some additional support. So definitely reach out with any questions in the text chat if anything comes up on today's session.
Thank you, Shelby. And yes, feel free to send a chat to either Shelby or me. And no, it's okay. You're fine, Emily. You're good. I just wanted to remind our participants if they're joining recently. Thank you. And now I will hand over a virtual mic to our presenter, Emily Austin. Go ahead, Emily.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Emily Austin, she, hers. Excited to see several familiar names and faces and profile pictures. We are almost through with this series that is like an introduction to working with survivors of sexual assault in various different community settings, in various different specialized vulnerable community situations, and really kind of building our community capacity around responding to survivors so that this information is not only housed in our rape crisis centers and sexual assault agencies, but also further in our community, building organizational capacity, empathy, and understanding around sexual violence. So I really am excited to see you all here and to be kind of today talking about something that is timely and related to our current world situation with our pandemic and the vulnerability that some workers face that is compounded by sexual violence and by the rape culture that we talked about in our first session. So today we're going to talk about vulnerabilities related to sexual violence that impact this subsection of folks called essential workers. And then we're going to also describe some best practices in supporting essential workers who experience sexual violence, and as always, connect you with those local resources for essential workers and anyone who experiences sexual violence. Today, I really kind of want to unpack what essential workers, who they are, and what help and support they may need. Again, just modeling a trauma-informed care response, I want to share the trauma-informed care warning with you that this content may impact you and could trigger feelings of concern, emotions, and or a physical response. Like we talked about in our resources webinar, we can't even really control these trauma responses. They're something that happen in our brain as a way to protect ourselves from a critical trauma. So we can't even control those. Listen to yourself and please take care of yourself. Step away as you need, turn down the sound, take a stretch break, reach out for support, utilize your resources, and recognize that we understand that trauma is complex. Today, just so you know, I'm not sharing video or anything that on the surface appears to be very provocative. It's a more general presentation, but I recommend always having a trauma-informed care discussion at the beginning of any of your presentations. So the first thing I wanted to do is have you chat in who are the essential workers in your life? What types of essential workers are you coming in contact with, or are you doing something to support, or that you see in your community? Or Andrea, sorry. Sometimes my pronunciation is horrible. Anyone, coming in contact with getting food? Who are you meeting in those spaces? ER nurse at Stanford, right. Emergency care nurse or emergency response nurse. Grocery store personnel. Vet techs, absolutely. I have a lot of animals at home, and if we have emergencies, we need to access those specialists. Mental health counselors. Oh, and just so Aberdeen put in a lovely chat too, there the closed captioning is not showing up as a button. So just go ahead and use the link they put in the chat if you would like closed captioning. PG&E, DMV. Right. So we have a lot of workers, and I bet if we, think even further, you'll be able to expand that list too. When during the shutdown and lockdown in our various counties and state, we were, experiencing our only contacts were with people that were either supporting the food chain or supporting our infrastructure like power, gas, water, and the things that kept our society going. So I wanted to share with you kind of how California is defining essential workers in this moment, just so we have a kind of shared understanding of what is essential. As an aside, in Florida, they actually were able to get WWE fighters, worldwide wrestling fighters deemed as essential workers. So this is something that is a social construct, right? So it depends on our setting and our state and our priorities. And for me, as a baseline, ethically, I think it has to do with workers that are forming essential functions for our society, without which we, really can't continue to function and keep people safe and healthy. So in California, we've had a mandate that's changed through the times, but when this was initially developed as essential worker definition, it was the stay-at-home order, except persons needed to maintain continuity of operations of essential critical infrastructure sectors. It's very legally eased, but this is people that keep our communities going. And the additional sectors of state public health that people can designate as critical. Maybe that's what happened in Florida, and that's how the WWE fighters were deemed essential workers. Roll of eyes, and I'll continue. So we have various sectors in California that are considered to be essential workers where people may not be able to work from home. Obviously, our emergency services and our health and public health sector, these are places where people that are having health issues, especially around times of pandemic, need to have access to these services. Our food and agriculture sector, this is a sector that is feeding us. And it includes everything from the growing and the harvesting, the transportation of the food, and then the selling of the food to communities. We have the energy sector, which is the way that we can get on all of our Zooms is by having energy at home. Water and wasteline sector, that's necessary for society to function. Transportation and logistics, which especially we'll be talking about essential workers that often need to use transportation systems to do their essential jobs, to get to their essential jobs. We have communications and information, that would be our power lines, and that would be our phone lines and our Wi-Fi, and the technology sector is included in that. And we have government operations and other. So these, are created, to be responding to the policies that are going to guide us during these times. Community-based essential functions, that includes our rape crisis centers and other essential food pantries and mutual aid through food security and different things that community-based organizations are doing. A critical manufacturing sector for the things that we need that we cannot go months and months without. Financial services, chemical sector. I think even when some of these sectors are shut down partially, there's needed staff to maintain them. And defense of the industrial base sector and industrial, commercial, residential sheltering facilities and services. One other provider of services is our domestic violence shelters, and they are part of this sheltering facilities sector. Also, we've seen incredible growth and use and shifting within our response to homelessness. In Los Angeles, we have been sheltering homeless folks more than usual because of wanting them to have an opportunity to be more distanced than on the streets. And we've seen, you know, sheltering orders and helping homeless people find shelter has been part of our public health response to the pandemic. So those are very critical essential worker functions. So I think we just really kind of, you know, we have the actual California law. You can go and look and see who is an essential worker, but I think we have a shared, you know, definition and a kind of general idea about essential workers as being necessary to keep our infrastructure functioning, medical care to humans and animals in our lives, and they're responding to emergencies and community safety. So these are kind of the three buckets or common themes I saw from that list in California, and wanted to offer you as kind of a shorthand to the legal policy as a way to think about essential workers in this time. This is from, I think it was 2019. So it's not completely current right now what our workforce looks like. But I wanted to share with you, essential workers has always been a definition even before the pandemic. And it's interesting here to see the gender and race breakdown, where what people are doing what essential work. One of the things I really, you know, was interested in is, I'm going to try and do a highlighter. Super fancy. So we see here that women are central to healthcare and community-based services. We see that women make up 76 and 73% of those populations. Whereas we see, you know, men are heavily represented in emergency services, which include law enforcement, transportation, warehouse, and delivery. So we see the genderification of the essential worker sector. We see that what has been typically concluded as female-based jobs are led by women in these essential spaces, and that the other types of jobs, the more attributed to masculine traits, are you know, in line with more men. Another, you know, place of huge discrepancy is this energy sector and waste management. So, you know, these sectors are heavily dominated by men. And when I look at the gender difference with essential workers, I see that, you know, when a job is dangerous, when it requires physical strength, it often is dominated by men, and those sectors are actually making more money. These are better paid jobs. They often have pensions, they often have protections or unions to support the workers. And the other sectors that are more female dominated do not have those and tend to be paid less. So we see that the gender divide translates to a different level of vulnerability as well. Another thing I thought that was interesting is that we see that a lot of essential workers, you know, have education levels that, you know, hit around the high school and maybe some college. Advanced degrees are not as, you know, connected with these essential worker positions, even though they're necessary for life to continue as we know it or as we are experiencing it. You know, one deviation from that is in the community and government-based services. We see more higher, you know, advanced degrees and college degrees in those settings as well. And then finally, I wanted to take a look a little bit at the racial divides among essential workers. We see in general that 55% of essential workers are white. However, we see that they are heavily represented in, you know, this government, healthcare, emergency services, and over here in the waste and management. And so these other areas, highlighting is getting a little off the charts. These other areas are more dominated by non-white workers. And so we see, especially even though the Black population is not a huge percentage of our general makeup, they have a lot of folks working in communications and IT, the healthcare area, and in transportation and warehouse development and delivery. So we're seeing kind of there's a difference of who's working where, and notice that most of those positions also have lower paying positions. Then in the Hispanic community, we see a very dominant, amount in the food and agricultural industry. And we know that that is all the way from growing and harvesting the food, transporting it, and selling it within our grocery stores. Another area with a lot of people from the Hispanic community or ethnicity, industrial, commercial, residential facilities and services. So kind of doing the home care and the residential facility care. And then the the Asian population, including Pacific Islanders, Alaskan Native, and various other API groups. We see it, more lower representation in emergency sector, with, kind of the peak being in the financial sector and healthcare and the chemical sector. So we're seeing a different spread of what workers are essential. And then other is, pretty small. So that would include our Native American colleagues and essential workers, and people that may not identify with any of the four racial ethnicities outlined here. So I wanted to pause there in case anyone else saw something that was interesting on this slide. So even though this was before pre-pandemic, we see that the essential worker workforce is, has some female dominated sectors. It also has some sectors that are dominated by folks of color. And without having the direct matchup with their salaries, from my research, we're seeing that the feminized labor, the ones that are more typically done by women, are significantly underpaid. So I think this, these stats really spoke to me as building an understanding around the vulnerability of essential workers, that even with our improvements on healthcare and healthcare access, 1 of 7 essential workers lack health insurance. 1 in 3 lives in a household that makes less than $40,000 a year. And talking about living in California on $40,000 a year to support a whole household is difficult. That is, even if it's not meeting poverty levels, it is definitely a struggle. It's a struggle to pay all bills, keep rent, and feed your family. And then the next part was millions of grocery store workers and slaughterhouse employees and home health aides rely on food stamps. So they are trying to make ends meet by needing food stamps or government assistance. So we know that a lot of essential workers are struggling economically. So those points really go to this, economic impact. We also know that a lot of these positions are more isolated and have greater risk of harassment and workplace abuse. We've seen in the Me Too movement and in our work around sexual harassment in the workplace that when there is an extreme power dynamic, it can create a workplace environment that's ripe for harassment and the misuse of power. And a lot of harassment is sexual in nature and connected to gender and or the intersection of race and gender and ethnicity. The other compounding piece of this vulnerability essential workers are facing is that there's more pressure than ever to keep the job at any cost. Uh, experts say we're likely facing years of recession / depression just from the break that the economy had to take during the shutdown. That is going to translate to people not being able to pay rent, to increased homelessness, people not being able to feed their families, increased need for food stability, and individuals are feeling on the brink of this type of recession and depression, that if they lose their job, they're going to really not be able to survive, and their family is going to suffer. And I think that although it's not been completely studied yet, I'm sure in the next year or so we'll have even more studies about how that is pressuring people to take the abuse or the harassment they're experiencing in the workplace, because to complain and to be the squeaky wheel the worry is that you'll lose your job and you'll lose that stability. So there's a huge vulnerability for essential workers that are feeling lucky to have a job in this environment where unemployment is high and where the risk of even further economic challenges is right on the horizon, to take the abuse, to trade off the abuse in order to get that paycheck. There's also a really difficult intersection with the increased risk of domestic and sexual violence at the home. And that's related to the stress of the pandemic, the economic impacts that are facing families, the physical stress. I mean, everyone who wants to raise their hand is like, has anyone got sick of whoever they're living with for during these 190 days of stay at home? So there's a stress and a friction just being in the same place and feeling like you can't leave that space, you can't have your own space. Additional stresses from the news and media, what is on the news and media, for people of color, for socially minded and social justice minded folks, the pandemic of inequality and police brutality is another stressor. All these things compound to make our intimate relationships more fraught, and increase the risk for domestic violence and sexual violence as a result of these stressors, as a compounding issue for stress. Especially when we think about, vulnerability of children, and not all children, women, and men are living in a home that is safe, and they often use being able to get out to work or be able to get out to another area as a way to modulate their safety at home. So we're seeing the statistics come in on this, and we know that there is a spike in reports of domestic violence. Sexual violence is less reported, is more underreported, but we do really expect that this pandemic is having a stress on folks at home. And imagine if you're an essential worker and you're scared to be out and then doing your work compounded with a stress at home is going to lead to, more and more opportunities for people to shift power and control. The next part with this essential worker piece is that, isolation is always a tactic of people who cause harm, to isolate someone from their resources. Isolation in this situation is very real because they may be even more isolated in the workplace, given that their workforce or the essential persons that can be in the workplace are limited, given that people can't even get close to each other, even when they're in the workplace. They can't get closer than 6 feet from each other, and it's sometimes hard to share emotions, share feelings from that kind of difference. It's hard to reach out for help when you're wearing a mask and your people don't want to engage. People don't even want to make eye contact with you. So essential workers are facing isolation within the workforce as part of being out in the world during this moment. And I also think that a lot of these essential jobs are, if they weren't isolative in the beginning before the pandemic now are more isolated. Instead of sending 3 people to do a job, like to do power work or whatever, they may be cutting down to just 1. So you're leading to more isolation of individuals within the workplace. That increases your vulnerability. For this work, because there has not been exhaustive research on sexual harassment, sexual violence in essential workers, I feel like it's really critical to bring back our practice of intersectionality and understanding the intersectionality. When we talked about immigrants and refugees and the higher levels of trauma they've experienced, that leads to a more vulnerability as essential workers and a lack of being able to reach out to law enforcement or to other help and support for fear of deportation or community repercussions. Similarly, with people of color, we're seeing that there is a systemic, distrust of law enforcement that is based on kind of how law enforcement has functioned in communities of color that will chill any kind of reach out for help or support or reporting of sexual violence and sexual harassment, both outside and within the workplace. There's the intersection of ability. So we know with both mental and physical different levels of ability, that leads to higher levels of isolation, as well as not being able to have, be able to move around and be able to access the resources you usually had in society. There's also the intersection of housing. So we know that with essential workers, a lot of them are actually in the low, and for low paid workers and low paid women, a lot of them are working, are in houses that are multifamily houses. So instead of having a whole house, you have a room for your whole family, and you may have to share kitchen, bathrooms, all that kind of things with other families. That leads to even more stress within this type of environment. It is a stressful living situation in general, and it is even more stressful given the current, pandemic. There's also transportation concerns. One study in New York, showed that the subway system was critical for essential low-paid essential workers to get to their job sites. But it also was a site of outbreak. And so trying to figure out that balance of how to get public transportation up and running and keep it as safe as we can, what is an intersection of that we need each of our areas to be undergoing to make sure that those that are low paid essential workers have a way to access their jobs and get to their jobs in a way that's safe, that's not going to end up exposing them to the virus and actually compounding their vulnerabilities. Another piece is just, as we are saying, millions of these workers are actually facing food security issues and not being able to put food on the table. And even sadly, in the cases where they're collecting the food, they're harvesting the food, they're selling the food, and not being able to feed their families. So just considering that intersection is very important. And then, as I mentioned before, that mental health and the stress of the situation is compounded when there's economic concerns, being a low paid essential worker, and there's these other concerns of not being able to turn to law enforcement if you're facing harassment, being concerned with survival, which is putting food on the table, feeding your kids, and not feeling that you're able to have the luxury of taking care of yourself. So that's not just, that's common to all folks that are experiencing this pandemic. But when we add the level of being an essential worker and being required to keep your job, you need to go into this environment. And then the number of low paid essential workers we have that are forced to go into this environment to keep their jobs, the stresses really the impacts can be exponential. There have been some really thoughtful writing and, considerations about how these intersections are really representing a paradox. So I wanted to share this quote with you about color and gender and COVID. Within this new ecosystem, a racial justice paradox has emerged. Blacks and Latinx are more likely to be unemployed due to the impacts of the pandemic on the labor market. But they're also overrepresented among essential workers who must stay in their jobs, particularly low skilled positions, where they are at greater risk of exposure to the virus. So this intersection, and I would really invite, if you want to share in this chat, what you think, how you think this is further complicated by sexual harassment or sexual violence. Is the racial justice paradox compounded by sexual harassment and sexual violence? Great, Gina. Yeah, exactly. You're safe at home, but you still want to, even though home may be a safe place for you, we still have a need to get out and to make connections and to be outside. And just imagine if your home is not safe. Also, if folks want to unmute and share, that's an option as well. Just trying to bring more voices into the room when talking about these vulnerable workers. Great, Jen. So Jen shared, I think it's compacted in so many ways. I don't know that I can even articulate my ideas, thoughts on it. I think that vulnerabilities existed prior to the pandemic. I would say absolutely. And they were very hidden. We didn't really talk about the essential workers as much as we're now talking and centering them because they're on the front lines. Or raise your hand in Zoom. I'll try and keep an eye on it. I think that essential workers are now, it's an opportunity for us to look at people that were most vulnerable in our society and try and center their needs and their intersectionalities, because it's become impossible. We cannot ignore their role in society and the interconnectedness of our lives with their work. I think the economic piece is very connected with this and is compounded with sexual violence, as kind of walked through before. Oh, great, Roxanne. Homeless people, persons of color in high density areas don't have safe places to go and increases their risk of sexual violence on the streets and increases their risk of exposure to COVID as well. So there's I see as people's vulnerability to exposure to COVID increases, so does their vulnerability to exposure to trauma, and being further isolated or taken advantage of or abused. Yeah, Omar, that's a great point around, say the raised levels of stress for all, law enforcement in particular, would add to the possibilities of Black and brown people being treated with even less humanity. And I would say that is a great way to bring in the stress level of the law enforcement community and persons that are doing that work. They're now operating in a crisis mode in the streets, and that crisis mode can reduce their judgment. It can make them be working in a trauma mindset. And we'd really talked about the impact of trauma is maybe you can't control yourself as much. And maybe you make decisions that the logical brain would not make. And so when they're that highly stressed, it's hard to make good decisions. Right. I also think a lot about janitorial, the Yabasta movement in California, and how isolated that workplace is, and how the power structure and the genderification of that, the gender dynamics of that workplace have been, we've just been trying to bring to light how significant that is for sexual violence and sexual harassment. Right. And I think that racial trauma intersection is another big component, because racial trauma interacts with traumas related to gender, traumas related to just surviving, and they, like the ACEs, they have an exponential impact on our life. Yeah. And what I love about a trauma-informed approach is really to bring in the historical perspective. So one of the principles of a trauma-informed approach is to never just kind of look at trauma within a vacuum or as only something that happens to an individual, but within a context of our histories of colonization and genocide that are very real in the US. Great, thanks. Thanks for all this participation. I think it's just important to bring, especially to essential workers and to low paid essential workers, that on top of the stress of them doing their job in this environment, they are facing myriad vulnerabilities. So, this is another quote talking and focusing on intersectionality, that 1 in 3 jobs held by women has been designated as essential. So we're seeing that a lot of the female-centered jobs are essential, and non-white women are more likely to be doing these essential jobs than anyone else. You know, thank you to Kimberly Crimshaw and all the work on intersectionality to really show that being a woman, you face issues. Being a person of color, Black woman, Black person, you face various forms of discrimination and oppression. And then that changes and is not just the sum of its parts when you're a Black woman. So that intersectionality is really talking about how that experience is unique. And we need to consider that there is both gender discrimination going on and racial discrimination going on. And that experience is not the same as for white women or for Black men. I always center that work. And then I think our history is being able to expand it out to even more intersections. Understanding that these essential jobs, and often, you know, what we don't have all the research on is that a lot of these essential jobs are low paid jobs, where then the economic pressures and the community pressures are added in on top of the race and gender divides and inequalities. This is a quote from Angela Jones, fast food worker fighting for increasing the minimum wage, that, you know, this was true before the pandemic, that they're exposed to more than COVID-19. They're exposed to daily humiliation, they're exposed to harassment, sexual violence and abuse, and they're exposed to vulnerabilities and power dynamics. So it's not just the COVID-19 that makes these workers essential and that impacts these workers. And I think that this is another really important intersection, is that the economic impacts have an intersection with sexual violence. So providing people dignity at work and being able to pay to support their families through a livable minimum wage creates situations where we can dismantle rape culture and also protect our most vulnerable, protect and provide support for the most vulnerable people and women that experience abuse and harassment. All right, so here's another chat question. I'm interested to hear how this pandemic has impacted your contacts with the community. including your contacts with essential workers. You always had contact with essential workers, but has anything changed during the pandemic? Thanks, Magna, for putting it in the chat. You're quicker, you're more quick than I. There's some social emotional contacts that I've observed, and I think we'll be hearing more research about, is that, you know, wearing a mask and needing to, and being 6 feet away does dissolve our ability to be close with people and for them to feel supported through body language. So now everything has to be highly verbal, and for me, I almost have to shout within a mask because it kind of stops my voice. So even the body signal and verbal cues that we give people are changed and limited during this time. It definitely has impacted work with clients. Most likely, if you are working with clients, you're having to do this through telehealth and video. If you aren't, then, you know, it might be really difficult to communicate and read body language with a mask on. And that's really hard when you're working on mental health issues and supports. Right. So the other thing is that's really interesting is there has been a change with access to people's personal lives. And this has a multiple impacts. So one thing is the Zoom allows us to see a picture into someone's house and see what is going on, but it also takes away anonymity and can be a destruction of safe space for someone who may be a survivor, may not be in the best home situation. Having someone be able to watch what's going on in their home is can have negative impacts. I will share one positive impact of this type of change is that a group of women and men that were doing parenting support and caregiver support for foster families found that working through Zoom actually allowed them to teach and support the in-house caregiver in the practices, the social emotional practices and support of children, because they were removed from the situation. Whereas before they would model the behavior, it allowed them instead to move to teaching the behavior. So always finding silver linings places. There's some places where we can have a learning from this type of Zoom intrusion. Right. There is a lack of ability to access community resources. And, you know, I totally hear Roxanne. I miss the human connections. I always feel like I can understand people better when I can see their full face and I can kind of see how what I say is landing. And as a trainer, I just wish we were in a room together because this would be a lot more fun and community building. Yeah, yeah. And then Omar had, in some ways, it gives us more info regarding the person you're dealing with. And many people will use the mask scenario as a conversation piece to discuss their political views. He's had several of these interactions. I'm wondering, Omar, could you clarify a little bit? I think you might be saying that like having a mask on protects them to be able to come out with their political views, or are they using the politicizing of the mask to talk about political views?
I'm gonna go ahead and unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's more. It's not even like a big deal. It's more like, you know, you walk in with a mask and you know you might make eye contact with someone and then they go, oh well, you know, I hate these masks and you know I'll be glad when it's over, or you know. So it's really not anything negative per se. It might be, you know. And then if I end up, you know, having a kind of a conversation with them where I make a statement too. It kind of just leads more to people kind of start feeling like maybe I agree with them that, we shouldn't have to wear masks or whatever. And so that's all I meant. So it's nothing really big. It's in interactions in the store, or, it's not even necessarily just with my job.
Yeah. And it's almost like a shared trauma, right? So like we're
Yes.
all kind of going through this historical trauma right now, and we'll have that to connect around. We have that to connect around for sure. Right. And I think that what is another thing that's been underscored in this moment is that there is a digital divide, and there's a difference, like Jen was saying, in people that have ability to access the internet and have the safety and privacy to be able to make calls. If they're living with the person who harms them, or, they're not in a confidential space, right? So like even if they're kids or someone else can hear their conversation. And when we look at that compounding vulnerability, we know that people, lower paid workers, lower paid essential workers, and people around the poverty level are often sharing housing where there's just not the same level of privacy. I laugh that I go and shut myself in a closet to do trainings and these kind of things, but I have the privilege of being able to have a closet I can close a door to. And that is not the experience of all people. And being able to have your own space is something that I think before the pandemic we took for granted, because we could always go outside or go to that coffee shop. And now we really can't escape our very specific shelter in the same way. Right. Stacy, that is a wonderful example too. This is again, like part of the silver lining on our connectivity with more parents and kids, more parents, caregivers, and kids home at the same time. You may have more access to the adults that are important in that child's life. Instead of, I've seen that with some of our school-based programs. Now they actually have the parent in the background, and if they had a scavenger hunt where like ask your parent for their favorite color or something like that, people can turn around and engage their parent or caregiver right away. And there's a way for, the anonymity, it can go both ways, but also you're exposing the parent and caregiver to what we're teaching the young people and how we're engaging the young people. And there have been some good growth then on them getting involved with the work we're doing in various programs in California. Great. Well, thank you all for that. I know it's Thursday, but I love your participation, and I'm really, I love hearing how you're connecting with your community still. And, it's not all good and it's not all bad. And we're learnings from this. So I wanted to talk about some, best ways to support essential workers. And what I find in my work is there's rarely like one particular silver thing. There's never particularly just one way to help everyone. You need a multi-prong approach. And I think what's most important with supporting essential workers is there's the camaraderie of putting up signs and saying you support and that kind of piece. But there's also, we have to have a realization that not all essential workers have the same level of support, and that low paid essential workers are struggling economically and doing critical work for our community with the risk that they may get COVID and not have health insurance. A lot of these workplaces are providing supplemental help and support, and I hope we as a community will continue to extend access to mental and physical health to all people. But it is a stress for someone that doesn't have health insurance to put themselves in harm's way knowingly while being an essential worker. So I think that one of the ways we can really support essential workers, and especially low paid essential workers, is increase access to health and mental health care supports. The rape crisis centers and the local communities that are providing support services and counseling are part of that, because mental health includes just figuring out ways to connect with people in your community. It doesn't have to all be sit down counseling services. mental health is a very broad, a broad idea, and has many ways people can take care of themselves and seek help from their communities and their peers. The next thing is, I think it's very important now more than ever, and I always felt it was important, was to provide resources and talk about sexual assault and gender-based violence, because people may have increased risk of vulnerability right now, and they are further isolated. So they may not be having these conversations within their workplace, and they may not even have their group of friends that they can talk to about what's happening to them. We need to be very vocal and take sexual violence out of the shadows and really kind of talk about its links to sexual harassment in the workplace, talk about rape culture, so people feel like it's normal to be able to talk about this, and that there are resources available. And then I think we really need to continue and expand the sexual harassment education in the workplace, because when we did the continuum of sexual violence in the first section, we see how these verbal, emotional attacks build and are related to physical assaults and attacks. And we know that when workplaces start to actually talk about this issue, they can affect social norms change within their workplace. I've worked with some unions and some, nonprofits about having these discussions, and even having the discussions and having the tough conversations and running through scenarios around sexual harassment in the workplace allows people to better identify their values and their social norms around sexual violence, sex discrimination. And then we don't really ever want to do it in a vacuum. While I'm very concerned about elevating sexual harassment education in the workplace, I'm equally an advocate for connecting it to all types of harassment and oppression within the workplace as well, and how those things intersect. And then finally, we need to find ways to reduce isolation for essential workers. And, it can be something like having a dignity parade, or like some sort of like thank you parade for workers, just to make them feel connected to community. And we also need to find ways for people to make human to human connections that support their mental health and reduce the level of isolation and silencing they have. And then the final piece, with the reduction of isolation, I think there also needs to be an increased accountability. And that does not translate, in my view, as to increased criminalization. Accountability is much broader than just the violation.
I think Emily is frozen.
I thought it was just me. Okay.
Yeah, we have a few minutes left. We'll just give Emily a couple of seconds to join us again. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Until then, if you have any specific questions that Emily could address, I see Michaela, you have a question, and hopefully Emily can address that. If not, then we can feel free to email me, and we can respond to that question. Emily is back.
I'm back. Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Okay, sorry, everyone. I'm full disclosure, I have a bunch of distance learning happening around me. So when everyone goes back on Zooms, I think my broadband gets a hit. I think that there's community accountability and ways that we can interrupt these things that are called microaggressions. If you haven't heard the term microaggressions,
Today seems to be the Zoom day.
sorry.
Are you back? Okay.
You probably missed that golden piece of information. It was just accountability is broader than criminalization. And I want to finish. I know we're at our end of time together today, but again, these local sexual assault agencies are a great resource for both sexual harassment in the workplace as well as sexual violence. And I pulled some specific worker resources. CalCASA has done work with the janitorial workers and union around exposing sexual violence in that sector and building community supports to educate and prevent that form of violence. There's also Time's Up, which is a legal resource around the Me Too movement, around sexual violence and sexual harassment. There's Equal Rights Advocates. Again, there's an intersection with law here that can be very empowering for survivors. And then there's nonprofit resources for essential workers and general resources for essential workers that are broader than just sexual violence, but ways that communities, organizations are stepping up to support essential workers during this time. So with that, I will stay on for a few minutes if you have any more questions. And it was a pleasure to share time with you again today. And I do see, I think there is resources on educational resources on sexual harassment. I will include some links to that on the website. Equal Rights Advocates has a bunch as well.
Thank you so much, Emily. And we are receiving just overall feedback and response, positive response and feedback. We're all thanking you.
Thank you all for putting up with my Zoom hiccup and me. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Take care of yourself, and